Within this final video of the first module, I'm going to summarize some of the key concepts that I've introduced over the course of the last videos. The first one being that an individual solve is just a snapshot. Each solver output is not, and I repeat, it is not the definitive or the game theory optimal way to play that particular hand of poker. Instead, it's just simply an estimate of an equilibrium solution for a very fictional poker scenario based on the very specific inputs and parameters that we provided. The inputs and parameters are limited as compared to our on-table options, and they rely on our own knowledge and our own assumptions. We are never going to get all of our ranges correctly. We are never going to get the bet sizings perfect. So that individual snapshot is not going to be the perfect game theory optimal solution. Understanding that is an important thing to know as we interpret the outputs of that fictional scenario of poker. The second concept that I like to introduce is the concept of 1 + 1 is greater than 2. And I know that's kind of weird when we think about it in terms of inequality that doesn't necessarily quite make sense. But the point I'm trying to make here is that while a single solve can be helpful to help us understand a specific scenario, multiple solves examined together can help us test the sensitivity of our outputs. And the impact of looking at multiple solves together is going to be far, far, far more valuable than just looking at one specific solve. And it's much more valuable to our poker development. Through doing things like testing and experimentation and looking at different variations, we can actually reinforce existing concepts and understand new insights that can help us develop better strategies. It's always going to be better looking at multiple solves together, and the sum of those individual solves are going to be greater than the individual solves themselves. The third one is the game tree is a fog of war. Small variations in strategy and the game tree are going to impact the expectation value much more significantly as we move closer to the river. It's partially due to an increase in pot size, but there's also just far more clarity over ranges and the equity of our combinations. Because of this, we actually have more definitive answers to how to play portions of ranges against our opponent's ranges, assuming that the assumptions of our ranges are somewhat close to accurate. When we actually kind of bring this back to the beginning parts of the game tree, it's hard for us to see out into the future. And solutions that we end up deriving on earlier streets calculate to equilibriums across all those various subsequent portions of the game tree, even when node locking, and it tends to smooth out the effect of strategy deviations. When we do ultimately node lock and change some things on earlier streets, while we might see some outputs and strategy changes that look fairly different to one another, we don't tend to see massive swings in expectation value because things smooth out over the course of those subsequent streets. Ranges balance out and the solvers tend to balance out downstream a little bit more. Understanding that you're not going to necessarily see those huge variations in EV on the flop, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the difference between two different strategies are going to be small in flop decisions. Understanding that there will be a smoothing effect downstream when we're looking at earlier street decisions is an important one there. And the final point I'll make here is that focus on trends and deltas, not specific metric values. As we've noted here, our inputs are flawed. And because of that, our outputs, which already have a little bit of a margin of error baked in, are going to have an additional error that's associated with them. So as a result, individual data points aren't necessarily reliable. But when we do use multiple solves together, we can actually see how those variations occur between those multiple solves, and we can start isolating things like trending directions and the magnitude of those different outputs, that how they change based on input variations, and that'll ultimately help us understand key concepts. And we're going to go through some of those tactics throughout the course, but it's important to understand that we really want to be looking at the deltas between two things. So how do those outputs change based on the changes of inputs, not necessarily that one individual snapshot. Well, now we've reached the end of Module 1 and foundational concepts. In Module 2, we're going to actually dive into solvers, and I'm going to introduce some of the commercial solver options that are out there and walk through how do you actually use those individual commercial options like PioSolver or GTO+. So stick with me and I'll see you in Module 2.